Hello. Recently at the Real Clear Politics 1776 series, political science professor Wilfred Riley wrote, "The United States may be the first country in history to tell a noble lie about its past that makes that past look worse than it actually was." He continued by citing the pre-modern history of the United States, which included a great deal of barbaric, uncivilized behavior, the conquest of Native Americans, the enslavement of captured Africans, and the oppression of women. But the popular left-wing models of historical education, namely the 1619 Project and Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, lack historical context. Riley rightfully pointed out that nearly all nations allowed slavery or serfdom until recent centuries. He also stated that such histories as the 1619 Project and Zinn's A People's History, quote, regularly make claims about further injustices and atrocities that are simply not based in reality. In my book, Debunking Howard Zinn, I set out to demonstrate why Zinn's outrageous claims about American injustices and atrocities are false. I will call them ignoble lies. They are on virtually every page of Zinn's best-selling A People's History of the United States, which has been in continuous publication since 1980. It remains a top seller, breaking publishing records with sales increasing each year, much of it due to its increased use in classrooms. If teachers are not assigning this book or chapters, they have a young people's history of the United States, spin-off books, and downloadable lessons from the Zinn Education Project. So how does Zinn make his ignoble lies? I went to the oldest and largest professional association of historians, the American Historical Association, to get their rules. I reproduced them in my book. I put them into bullet points. Here they are from the American Historical Association's Statement on Standards of Professional Conduct. First bullet point. Historians should document their findings and be prepared to make available their sources, evidence, and data, including documentation through interviews. Second point, historians should not misrepresent their sources. Third point, they should report their findings as accurately as possible and not omit evidence that runs counter to their own interpretation. Next point, they should not commit plagiarism. And finally, they should oppose false or erroneous use of evidence, along with any efforts to ignore or conceal such false or erroneous use. So let's begin with the first rule. Again, historians should document their findings and be prepared to make available their sources, evidence, and data, including documentation through interviews. Howard Zinn said that he did not provide such documentation, namely footnotes, because they would clutter up his book. Also, the book was written to be used as a textbook, and textbooks usually do not have footnotes. But textbooks are generally written by multiple authors and have a review process. They do not make original or controversial historical claims. But that was not the case with Howard Zinn, who claimed to be a path-breaking historian uncovering a long-suppressed history. Zinn wanted to have it both ways. Zinn makes a number of large claims by referring to vaguely named sources that are just about impossible to find. In fact, he even cites sources that he admits may be fictional. For example, Zinn quotes about 300 words from a speech by Chief Powhatan to John Smith in 1607. Zinn claims that the speech was, quote, prophetic. Chief Powhatan is quoted as saying, "I have seen 2 generations of my people die. I know the difference between peace and war." He then goes on to ask John Smith why he would, quote, "take by force what you may have quietly by love. Why will you destroy us who supply you with food?" And on. Such words are uncharacteristic of the warrior chief, and Zinn admits that the speech's authenticity, quote, "may be in doubt." However, although it may be in doubt, he says, it is so much like so many Indian statements that it may be taken as, if not by the rough letter of that first plea, the exact spirit of it. Exact spirit? What does Zinn mean by that? Why did Zinn not quote a speech that was authentic and for which he could give information about its source? Another example concerns Zinn's claims about, quote, a record of deaths kept in a plantation journal, now in the University of North Carolina archives, which lists the ages and causes of death of all those who died on the plantation between 1850 and 1855. These ages, as Zinn quotes them, appear to be quite young. But these are from one plantation, and a plantation identified only by the fact that the journal resides in the, quote, the University of North Carolina archives. How could we ever check Zinn's claim? And Zinn provides no context. He does not present comparative statistics, such as the average lifespans and other indicators of health among other groups, like the lower classes of Europe at the time. According to the AHA's own standards, such murkiness about sources would disqualify Zinn's book as legitimate history. Here's another AHA rule. Historians should not misrepresent their sources. Howard Zinn quotes from sources selectively in order to misrepresent them. He does this beginning on page 1. In quoting Christopher Columbus's diary, Zinn uses ellipses, those 4 dots used to indicate a short omission of non-essential words. But in Howard Zinn's hands, these ellipses leave out critical information. Consider this part of the quotation that Zinn provides from Columbus's diary to imply that Columbus wanted to subjugate and enslave the native Arawaks in order to get gold. I quote, "They would make fine servants, ... With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." End of quotation. But notice those 4 dots, the ellipses. What's missing? First, Zinn does not indicate that they probably refers to a hostile tribe that thinks these Arawaks would make fine servants for them, and he leaves out 2 days' worth of diary entries, entire pages in which Columbus expresses his belief that, to give just one short example, and I quote, "they are a people who can be made free and converted to our holy faith more by love than by force." Zinn does the same thing in his chapter about the Vietnam War. Zinn claimed that the American government lied about being worried about communist expansion in Indochina, but really, in typically imperialist fashion, wanted the resources of Indochina, such as, quote, rice, rubber, coal, and iron ore. As evidence, Zinn quoted from government documents, but he quoted deceptively. One document is identified by Zinn as a 1953 congressional study mission that reported the area of Indochina is immensely wealthy in rice, rubber, coal, and iron ore. Its position makes it a strategic key to the rest of Southeast Asia, end of quote. Here again, Zinn is being vague about his source. Actually, the real source can be found in the first volume of the Pentagon Papers, which Howard Zinn himself, along with Noam Chomsky, edited. There, one can learn that the report is by Representative Walter Judd, a recognized Republican spokesman on Asia. There, one can read the sentence that immediately follows the one Zinn quoted. And I quote, "If Indochina should fall, Thailand and Burma would be in extreme danger. Malaya, Singapore, and even Indonesia would become more vulnerable to the communist power drive." Communist power drive. Also in that report was the explanation that Secretary of State John Foster Dulles regarded Southeast Asia a key region in the conflict with communist imperialism. So it's communist imperialism that the American government was worried about. Remember, this is in a volume that Zinn himself edited, the Pentagon Papers, the papers that his friend Daniel Ellsberg had stolen. Zinn hid these papers for Ellsberg. He knew exactly what they said, but he chose to leave out the critical information that would reveal the truth about communist imperialism. Let's go on to the next AHA rule. They should report their findings as accurately as possible and not omit evidence that runs counter to their own interpretation. Okay, let's look at something that should have hit Howard Zinn smack dab in the face as he opened the morning paper while writing his magnum opus. And this concerned the Vietnam War protests, a cause near and dear to Zinn's heart because he led the protests. He writes in his book about the Catonsville Nine, the 9 protesters led by Daniel and Philip Berrigan, who broke into a draft board office in Catonsville, Maryland in 1968 and burned draft cards outside before an audience that included reporters. According to Zinn, one of the 9 was Mary Moylan, a former nun. Zinn claimed, ominously, that she, quote, refused to surrender to the FBI and was never found. This implies that she was murdered by the FBI or other government agents. Actually, on June 21st, 1979, while Zinn was writing A People's History, both the New York Times and the Washington Post reported that Moylan had surrendered. Moylan spent only a year in prison. Then she resumed her career as a nurse and worked for several years at Queen Anne's Hospital in Chestertown, Maryland. She died in 1995 of natural causes. And consider this omitted evidence regarding Japanese internment camps in World War II. Zinn claimed that the Japanese internment camps were hidden from the American public. This is what he wrote in A People's History of the United States. Not until after the war did the story of the Japanese Americans begin to be known to the general public. The month that the war ended in Asia, September 1945, an article appeared in Harper's Magazine by Yale law professor Eugene V. Rostow, calling the Japanese evacuation, quote, "our worst wartime mistake." So let's ask, was this a secret kept from the general public, as Zinn claims? Not at all. The major newspaper, the New York Times, began reporting on plans for internment camps weeks before President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. That year, the Office of War Information made a 10-minute informational video about the camps. It was distributed by the War Activities Committee of the Motion Picture Industry. So people were watching it in movie theaters. And the very same magazine, Harper's, had published a 10-page article in September of that year, 1942, by reporter Kerry McWilliams. He described his visit to a camp established at the Santa Ana racetrack. McWilliams did not see prison conditions, which Zinn claimed were characteristics of the camps, and in Zinn's words, almost in direct duplication of fascism. In fact, McWilliams wrote, "It would certainly not be accurate to characterize Santa Ana as a concentration camp." What McWilliams described in the camp was the opposite of what Zinn insinuated, and McWilliams's reporting was consistent with other honest accounts. Another rule of the American Historical Association concerns plagiarism, or presenting someone else's work as one's own. They say the same thing your high school teacher said. Don't do it. Okay, so this is their rule. Historians should not commit plagiarism. As for plagiarism, I document how the first 5.5 pages of Zinn's book are copied from this little paperback written by his friend Hans Koning, a fellow anti-Vietnam War protester, and a novelist and screenwriter and not a historian. It's a book for high school students. Zinn also plagiarized extensively from this book by Gary Nash. So check out my book in order to read side by side multiple passages that show exactly how Zinn plagiarized, how he copied from these authors. Here is another thing the AHA says historians should do. They should oppose false or erroneous use of evidence along with any efforts to ignore or conceal such false or erroneous use. Well, we've seen a few of the many uses of false evidence by Howard Zinn. But does the American Historical Association itself oppose such false use of historical evidence? To the contrary, the American Historical Association has come to the defense of Howard Zinn when others have tried to remove the fake history from public classrooms. One case occurred in 2013 when it was revealed that when he was governor of Indiana in 2010, Mitch Daniels tried to keep Zinn's book out of publicly funded schools. The American Historical Association also opposed Arkansas Representative Kim Hendren's bill in 2017 to keep Zinn's book out of that state's public schools. In fact, they offer the Zinn Education Project as a legitimate source for teachers. Most recently, they put out a statement against the White House Conference on American History, at which I participated on Constitution Day 2020, and where I discussed Howard Zinn's falsified history. The question remains, does the American Historical Association not live by its own rules?